up in the Kufiyah, we're going to be okay. Okay. Zok the Heilige Gemara. Hamachalak nechos of alpiv, ribo lacho dumit lacho. And you with a lashon matana, if with a lashon matana, the person gifts whatever chelik he wants to whomever he wants, that will work. Now the Mishnah says in this document with which he gifts the non-yoirish, the properties or the assets that he wants to give him, it has to say somewhere in that star the words matana. Even if it also says the word Jerusha, as long as either at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end, the Mishnah says, it says the word matana, that will be the right syntax and it'll work with Torah matana. So, Frank the Gemara, heichadami matana betchila, heichadami beemtza, and heichadami besayf. Can you give us a nusach that would actually meet one of these three requirements? Tinasein sada ploinis laploini v'yirsha. If that's what he wrote, this sada should be given to Pliny, and he should yarshin it. Zui matana b'tchila. That there he uses the word tinasein right at the beginning of his statement. If he wrote yirsha v'tinasein loi, he should yarshin, and it shall be given to him. Zui matana b'soif. That meets the requirements of making saying the word matana to end. The yersha, the tinasen the yersha. So he has the word tinasen sandwiched in between two shayus of Yerusha. Zuhi matana be'emtza. But it could be written or it could be spoken. If he's a shchiv merak, it could be spoken because he doesn't have to have a kinyan, and if it's a buri, he has to write it on the star and make a proper kinyan. Correct. It doesn't mean where?
Where in the document?
To the phrase in the document. I mean, there could be other stuff written in the document. Okay, Moscow. This mentioning somewhere in the document, the word matana is only if the whole gift that we're discussing here is one field and one person. So therefore, all of the words you used, matana and Yerusha, are both referencing the exact same transaction. So that means this transaction must have been covered also by the word matana. But what if you're gifting one person two fields, where you could interpret it as the word matana refers to one of the fields, and in maybe the other fields he's trying to do Yerusha, which would not work. Or soda achas or shnei b'nei adam, or the opposite. If he was giving the north half of the field to Reuben and the south half of the field to Shimon, and by Reuben it used the lashon matana, and by Shimon it used the lashon of Yerusha, loy, that would not work. That is the shita of Rabbi Yochanan as related by Rav Dimi. We're soon going to see that Ravin will disagree with what Rav Dimi said in Rabbi Yochanan, and there'll be a machlokes between Ravin and Rav Dimi about what Rabbi Yochanan said. But for now, Rabbi Yochanan said that this whole thing only works if we're talking about one. It's clear that we're referring to one transaction to one person. But Rabbi Lazar, he's a lot more liberal. He said, "Afilu adam echad ushtei sados." I said the achas shnei b'nei adam. There, you'll still say that both lashonis are applying to both transactions. Aval b'shtei sados ushnei b'nei adam. But if it's two completely separate transactions occurring, giving field A to Reuven and field B to Shimon, and it mentions a lashon Yerusha here and a lashon matana there, loy. There you cannot say that the lashon matana referencing one transaction will also be considered as referencing the second transaction. But it will work for the first transaction, correct. So if you say the ploini zu tinasen leruvain usada ploini zu yirsha Shimon. So there clearly the tinasen is going on Reuven's transaction, and the Yershu would be going on Shimon's transaction. But Adovi's raising a good point, because it's possible to phrase it in such a way where the Tanosan will sound like it's going on both. Right? And that's what you're bracing, and that's the nitty-gritty that we're going to get into now. So really it depends on exactly how you're structuring that phrase. But we're speaking simply now. He also Ravin Omar, when Ravin came, he said a little differently. He said, Tinosin Sada Ploinis, Leploini, the Yirish Ploini, Sada Ploinis. So you can see it's like two separate phrases, right? That he holds Rabbi Yochanan Merkana, which is exact opposite, because this opinion seems to be even more liberal than Rabbi Lazar in the last round, because Rabbi Lazar holds Shtei Matanos, the Shnei people wouldn't work. And this sounds very much like two different fields to two different people, and it still works. So that's going to require a little bit of an explanation. Rabbi Lazar Amir Loikon. So Amalei Abai LaRavin. So Abai told Ravin, An Chasis Lon Chada, one of the things you said makes sense to us, which will be, of course, Rabbi Lazar. Vit Kavtas Lon Chada. But one of the things you said causes us to have a stira. Bishlomo Rabbi Lazar Loikash. Rabbi Lazar here says it doesn't work, and Rabbi Lazar there seems to say it does work. That's not fair, because where does he say it works? Kan ba'adam echad u'shtei sadais. So the first Rabbi Lazar that we quoted is referring to adam echad and shnei sadais, or shnei b'nei adam and one sad, right? Both those transactions, Rabbi Lazar holds that the lashon matana could reference both of them. But here, where Rabbi Lazar is quoted as saying it doesn't work, you'll say it's kan b'shnei b'nei adam u'shnei sadais. So that Rabbi Lazar is fine. El Rabbi Yochanan cut. You quoted Rabbi Yochanan as saying Shtei b'nei Adam and Shnei Sadais is good, and Rabbi Dimi quoted Rabbi Yochanan as saying even Shnei b'nei Adam and one side is bad. And for the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan, maybe it's simply a machlokes as to what Rabbi Yochanan said, and therefore Ravin said that Rabbi Yochanan holds even Shnei b'nei Adam and Shnei Sadais will still be good enough of a reference, since it's in the same star, I guess. And Rav Dimi said, no, such thing. Only if it's one person and one proper. But for Shlokish wants to say maybe it's not a Stephen or Beichtam. Maybe you can make a distinction between the case referenced by Ravin versus the case referenced by Rav Dimi. And this is what Rish Lakish is. Rish Lakish Omer Loi Kasha, Loi Kana. Let's just look at how the Bach amends this over here. The Bach says in the base, La'olam loikana. He's fixing the word la'olam. La'olam loikana. Let's say that Rabbi Yochanan really holds that even if you have Shnei b'nei Adam and one Sada, or Shnei Sada to one b'nei Adam, it would not work. So where did Ravin quote Rabbi Yochanan, indicating that it does work, even by Shnei b'nei Adam and Shnei Sadais? That's where it's very specifically, where the phrase was very specifically structured in a way that indicates it's actually referring to both. So, la'olam la'kana, if there's two people and two Sadais, ach yomer as follows. Ploini u'ploini. Reuben and Shimon, Yershu should get Sada ploinis u'ploinis. Reuben and Shimon should be Yerush A and B. Shena satim lahem, that I've given to them bimatana, v'yirshum. So here you have two times v'yirshum and one time matana. Dr. Rashbam, one Yerusha refers to each guy. The matana, you got to split down the middle. So there, in this case, the matana would work for both. Now, the Rashbam elaborates on different options of syntax that will, in fact, work. It's a long Rashbam, but it's a very simple Rashbam. So let's read it through quickly. Even b'shtei sadosh u'shnei b'nei adam, hahu the lashon Yerusha. And one that has a lashon Yerusha, it'll still work. Vafilu ki amar l'shneim b'yachad. He's told two people together. Tinazon sada ploinis l'Ruben, v'sada ploinis l'Shimon v'yirshum. That will work. Why? The gufin mechlokin. I'm sorry, this will not work. In this case, la'olam loikana it won't. When won't it be koina if it's two? If it looks like two separate phrases, matana referring to one and yershum referring to the other. The kivan the gufun mechlak in ninu. Since there's literally two separate transactions that here, there's no mingling of the two. He's first talking about the first transaction using a lashon matana, and then he's talking about a second transaction using a lashon yerusha. One nusach, one expression is referring to the ma'aseh, first ma'aseh, and the other nusach is referring to the second ma'aseh. L'echad lashon matana, l'echad lashon yerusha, al rishon rishon, val achron achron, hilchach loikanu ad sheyomer yerusha b'tchila. Okay, so that's a hilchach. So this, up until this point, this was the Rabbi Yochanan as quoted by Rav Dimi, where it doesn't work, right? Where does it work? Hilchach loikani, it will work at sheyomer yerusha b'tchila, but yerusha b'soif umatana be'emtza. That's how it's structured. Now the hash the yalef lashon matana and lashon yerusha. The hechi the lashon yerusha nemer l'shneim, just like he used the lashon yerusha for each of them. It's clear because he used yerusha at the beginning, yerusha at the end. Gama matana, which could go either way, sheba emtza nemra bal korchach l'shnein. We'll say it also applies equally to both transactions, and therefore they will both be valid. The lamantaria, it's there in the middle. There's no reason to apply it to the first transaction more than there is to apply it to the second transaction. And since it can go either way, so this is what you should say. If you want it to work in a phrase that has two separate transactions and you want matana to work for both, this is how you need to say it. Reuben v'Shimon, Yershu sada ploini uploinis uploinis. So it's sort of wrapping the two transactions together. And then he adds the word shenasati lahem b'matana and v'Yershu. So there's a lot of lashonis over here. The al korchach yershu kamo, the first lashon yerusha, oila al Reuben, is going on the transaction that he was referring to when he said Reuben. Basra, the second yerusha will refer to the second transaction with Shimon. Hilchach l'shneim nami lashon matana kamo. Since he's sort of passing around the terms equally to each of the two transactions, we'll say the word matana as well is referring to both transactions. The ikatarte zimni lashon matana. And we say there's two lashon matanas here because he said his lashon was shenasati lohem b'matana, right? Shenasati lohem. I'm sorry, I'm wrong about what I said. You know why there's a lashon of matana twice? Because it says shenasati lohem. So the nasati mineo bei is referring to two people because it says lohem. It doesn't say shenasati loy. The mi'arif, it's mixed together. A lashon yerusha, the ikatrei zimni lashon yerusha. So it says lashon yerusha twice, and it says one lashon matana, which clearly is in plural, nasati lohem, so it applies to both. That's where it will work. Avalim omar ploini uploini, yershu sada ploinis uploinis, and then there's another whole phrase vitinosin lahem sada ploinis uploinis v'yershum. There you wouldn't say that anymore because there havamina the high vitinosin v'yershum hashimenkot. That sounds like the Tinosin is only referring to the second transaction, and therefore v'leikana Reuben. In this case, the first transaction we would say is only a Yerusha, which would not. Since he split this up into two separate ma'asim, so too you should say that each lashon mentioned, each term mentioned refers exclusively to only one of the two transactions. Ploini uploini, Reuben and Shimon, Yershu sada ploinis uploinis, Shenasati lem b'matana, V'loy Amar Yershum l'b'soif, and he didn't say Yershum l'b'soif. Again, since there's one lashon Yerusha, one lashon matana, akati avamina l'rishon lashon Yerusha, l'sheni lashon matana. The shtei l'shonos keneged shtei matanos. So even though he sort of wrapped it together, but since he used two l'shonos and there's two transactions, we would say one's referring to one, one's referring to the other. But if he's referring to both transactions in the same phrase, and he uses the lashon Yerusha twice, and he uses the lashon matana once, we'll say that his intention is that just like the term Yerusha was referencing both transactions, so too the lashon matana is referencing both transactions. So it's a little bit of a complex way to look at it, but the way Rish Lakish looks at it, in fact, there's no contradiction at all. between the two halachas that Rabbi Yochanan was quoted as saying. So let's just do a little bit of an inventory of what we seem to have over here in Shitas. The Shita that's the most stringent would be the original Rabbi Yochanan that says that the only time it works if it's one sada to one person. Okay? Then you have Rabbi Lazar being a little bit liberal, one person, two fields, or two people, one field, or two people, one field. It would also work, but not two people in two fields. And then we have the Ravin's version of Rabbi Yochanan, who's all the way in the other direction, that even two people and two fields can work, right? And you have Reish Lakish is a hybrid. We'll put that off to the side. Reish Lakish learns that depending on how you phrase it, it's possible that even according to Rabbi Yochanan, even by two people in two fields, it would still work. So now that we have the four options, Zotmer Beplukta, we're going to quote now two Tanoi or two Amoraim, and they're going to fit into, each of them will fit into one of the shitas mentioned above. Amar Rav Hamnuna said, Lo yishanu ela adam echad v'soda achas, aval adam echad u'shtei sodas, soda achas u'shnei b'nei adam loy. That, I would say, is referring to the shita of Rabbi Yochanan according to Rav Dimi, right? Let me see if I'm right. Let me check myself. It looked up. So I'm just looking at the Rishon. Rav Hamnuna, Rav Dimi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So that checks out. Now, Rav Nachman Amar, afilu adam echad u'shtei sodas, or soda achas u'shnei b'nei adam would work. Aval shtei sodas u'shnei b'nei adam loy. That clearly is Rabbi Eliezer, right? So let's check that. Rav Nachman's Rabbi Eliezer. Good. And Rav Sheshes Amar, afilu shtei sodas u'shnei b'nei adam. That would work as well. That's clearly Rabbi Yochanan as delivered by Ravin. So let's look at it. Rav Sheshes Karavin Alibid Rabbi Yochanan. So those are our three sheets. So Rav Sheshes Mina Aminu. Rav Sheshes, who holds like the second Rabbi Yochanan. Where do I get that even two Sadas and two Bnei Adam, you will still say that the Lashon Matana applies equally to each of the transactions? The Tani we learned a little bit of a different case, not talking about Yerusha, but let's look at this case and how it's compared to our case. Either someone was dying and he was talking about the distribution of his assets, or he was going away for an extended period of time and he wanted to instruct whoever was going to be in charge of his assets to support his children. So he said, I want every week my son to get a shekel. Now, the Rashbam says, a shekel is not nearly enough per week. You would need a selah. You would need tushkol. So he said, give my son what is an impossible to live off amount, give him that per week. But v'ru'uyin litin selah, normal expenses per week would really be a selah. The halach is noistanam selah, because we interpret what he said. He doesn't want to starve his child to death. He just wants them to be frugal. Don't give more than you have. So when he said shekel, he didn't literally mean shekel. He just means go easy, be careful, give him the minimal amount required. But the im amor al titnu lehen elo shekel, which is a much more forceful lashon, that means I don't care if they can't survive. That's all I want to give them. Therefore, ein noishlam elo shekel. But the im amar. But what if he said imesu? If they die. So while my children are alive, they're going to get one shekel or salah per week. Once they die, I don't want it to follow the normal patterns of Yerusha and that my estate should go to my grandchildren. Rather, I want two strangers to receive it. Now, the Brisa goes weiter and says, Bench Amr Tanu. Saivi said Tanu shekel of ni. Or Bench Amr Al Titnu, there ain't noislam el shekel. Why is that? Because if I was saying it, you'll say that 10 shekel doesn't literally mean it. It just means that they should be frugal. He only really means it if he says, I'll take new el shekel. But if he specifically says, after my children are no longer alive, I want the rest of the money to go to a third party, there he means business, because he wants to make sure to preserve money to go to the third party. Otherwise, he wouldn't have said, afterwards give it to these people. The moment he says afterwards give it to these people, it means he wants to be very frugal in what he's distributing to his children because he wants there to be something remaining to go to that third. But I'll call upon him. The properties here that are first going, there's really two things happening. There's again two transactions and two fields, because there's the fields and the net that it puts out right now while the children are alive. And then there's a whole separate set of fields, even though it's the same field, but it's transferring over. So it's the field from 1991 to 1992 is going to his kid, but the field from 1992 to 1993 is going to somebody else. We look at it as if it's two separate fields, so I'm talking about two different times. So this is very comparable to the case of Shnei B'nei Adam and Shnei Sados. It says it will go to the next people after the children die. That means it must have been a Lashon Matana, because a Lashon Yerusha wouldn't work to give it to a third party. So you see the Lashon Matana works, even though he had a Lashon of Yerusha, right? It says, what are the words he said? Hitnu Livni and Yirshu Tachtein. So it's two B'nei Adam, it's two Sados, and it uses the word Matana, referencing the children, Yerusha referencing the other people. It simply doesn't work. How could it possibly work? Elamaya must be that you apply all the terms to everybody, and you mix everything together, so you have a right to Rav Sheshes, who also is the same shita as the second shita of Rabbi Yochanan. So that was the right that Rav Sheshes brought to himself. Zok Rav Sheshes, it sounds good, but l'mais it's not really a right. You know what? Because it's taka Lashon Yerusha. How could a Lashon Yerusha work? Because here's a special case. The Acherim who who's instructing the Yerusha to go to, doesn't mean two people off the street. It means people who would have yashned him anyway, and it's following the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan, where you have a right to divert your Yerusha from the proper Yerush to another Yerush. And we're going to soon see there's actually a discussion of what Rabbi Yochanan meant. A person has 3 sons. They're all going to be Yarshnikim. They're all in the first round of Yerusha. Does he mean in such a case, I could say I want an all to go to one of my 3 sons? Or maybe if I have sons and I also have a father alive, I could say I don't want to go to my children, I only want to go to my father. So his father's also Yerush, but he's a second round pick, right? So there's a shaila how far Rabbi Yochanan ben Bereika is going. Does Rabbi Yochanan, that will be discussed in detail tomorrow. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Bereika, regardless what he could possibly mean, in either case, it would be considered a valid Yerusha, and the term Yerusha would work. So in fact, you don't have a right from here that the term Matana was also applying to the second Nesina, because the second Nesina could only be an expression of Yerusha, but according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Bereika, that expression of Yerusha will in fact work. So Amar Rashi Tashma, let's try another brisa on to see if we could bring a raya from the second brisa that the Lashon Matana mentioned in reference to one phrase will also apply to the other phrases in the same distribution. Someone said, Nichselach, I want all my nechosim to go to you after I die. V'acharecha, or no, maybe he's even alive now. That could be alive. Nichselach, I'm giving you my nechosim now. V'acharecha, and when you die, yiyarish play. The second that you get it with Toyras Yerusha. V'acharecha, and when the second person dies, I don't want to go to his children. A year is ploying, it should go to a third party. So now I'm actually talking about 3 Nesinas to 3 different people. Nichselach is, even though he didn't use the Lashon Matana, he obviously means a Lashon Matana. He's giving it in his lifetime. So you have 1 Matana and 3 transactions, and the second 2 transactions, he used Lashon Yerusha. Awesome. It's a beautiful question. Absolutely not. And that's one of the points of the Gemara to bring up. Right? If you already said he should yashin it, so you can no longer divert it after he yashin it. It's fully. Yerusha means it's Jewish completely. That's going to come up. It's an excellent point. So nechasei loch, which is a lashon matana. V'acharecha yirish ploini. V'acharecha yirish ploini. Meis rishon, if the first person dies, kana sheni, the second one gets it. And meis sheni kana shlishi. However, the meis sheni b'chaye rishon. What if the second fellow died while the first person was still alive? We don't say it jumps to the third person. Rather, Yasu Nechasim Liyorshe Rishon. They will go to the Yorshe Rishon because I only said that it should go to the third person after it goes to the second person. But since it didn't, then it stays by the first person because it couldn't go to the second person because he was not alive. After the first person dies, since it can't go to the second person because he's not alive, it goes to the first person's direction. So basically, the cycle stops. The cycle stops, and then it falls from there, following the normal structure of Yerusha. Freik the Gemara. V'hahacha dechishtei sados ushnei bnei adam. These is clearly separate transactions and separate sados, since they're not concurrent. It's one after the other, so we look at each sada as a different sada because it's for a different set of time, right? So in this case, it's really shloisha sados, shloisha bnei adam, but if it's even only shnei sados and shnei bnei adam, it worked. How would it possibly work? So now already it's starting to make sense to Dovi. Why? Because the second guy doesn't mean Yerusha. The second guy was also Matan, and therefore it's going to work. But the problem is he used a loss in Yerusha. So your kasha was precisely what the right is. You can't say it's Yerusha because if it's Yerusha, then you can't set up two levels of Yerusha. The first guy to get the Teresh Yerusha is his permanent. So it must be that it's working with Teresh Matan. So you have a raya that if anywhere in the whole discussion the word matana is mentioned, even though it's only referencing the first, it'll also apply to the second. No, if you want to claim you don't have a raya from either, because this is also being with the Lashon Yerusha, then you have David's kash. Doesn't work like that. Because Rav Avia, Rav Acha, Rav Avia, the Div Rabbi Yechim and Breka, according to Rabbi Yechim who holds that you could actually make it a Yerusha, even though it's not going to your son. If the first one is royal Yerusha, in this case, that's Rabbi Acha talking about. He's talking about Nechasilach v'Echa Ploni. But in our case, where you said Nechasilach v'Echa Yerush Ploni, v'Acharav Yerush Ploni, so we'll talk about the second and the third. The second fellow was royally Yerusha, and that's why you want to claim it works because it was Teresh Yerusha. Well, then they can't go to the third person. Ein l'sheni b'makam rishon klum. She'ein zaloshem matana l'shen Yerusha v'Yerusha ein lahefsek, which is exactly what David said. Yerusha is the end of the line. You can't now say after him it should go somewhere else. Once it's Yarosh, David's 100%. So therefore, the only way that this could have worked in the case of the Chasilach, the Acharecha Yerush Ploni, the Acharecha Yerush Ploni is only if the second guy was not getting it to Teresh Yerusha, he had to have gotten to Teresh Matana. But the problem is it says a loss in Yerusha. So you have a raya from here that if it uses two transactions, then the Chasilach transaction A, and then the Acharecha Yerush Ploni transaction B, the Lashon Matana in transaction A will also be equally applied to transaction B. You have a beautiful right? It's who does it?
You said, I'm giving you as a matana, and then after you is going.
So if the guy who got it matana sold it, would that mess up the cycle? So if you remember, we had this discussion with the Savta. A guy said that if I die, I want my nechasim to go to my grandmother, and after my grandmother, it should go to my Yerush. And what happened was, he gave it to his grandmother. It must have been Tosh Matana. And then the Gemara tells us he gave it to his grandmother, and then after his grandmother died, he wanted to go to his daughter. The problem is his daughter was married, and by the time the grandmother died, his daughter had died already. And his son-in-law now is coming to make a claim because it came to my daughter. So one of the first the Gemara said is, since if the grandmother sold it, it would stop everything in its tracks. It's a raya that the daughter was never a muksik in it, and therefore her husband doesn't get it. So the Gemara says fair. If the first person sells it, stops everything. I guess so.
But obviously,
if it wouldn't have been sold,
until a certain point.
I guess it's yours until a certain point. You could do that.
Say, give me a gift for 1 year.
I guess you could. I guess you could if you said it that way. So here it had to have been. I'm sorry. That's right. That's right. It says, or it could maybe it's only Kenya Paris, Kenya Gulf. There's a lot.
But then he was made.
Because they only have pairs in it. You're right. Good point. So Zok Gemara. So here it's a checkmate over here. Here you can't say it's working with Rabbi Yochanan ben Berger's principle because then it could have never went to the third guy. So it has to be matana. So you have a raya. Zok Gemara tiyufta the kulut yufta. That means the first Rabbi Yochanan, as quoted by Rav Dimi, is Augushlagen, and even Rabbi Lazar is Augushlagen, right? Because you have clear proof that anywhere in this discussion where the lashon matana is used, we could say it applies equally to any other transaction mentioned, even though those other transactions he expressed with the lashon. Frank Gemara lema nami tavatshuvta to Rish Lakish. Now let's see how Rish Lakish fits in over here, because Rish Lakish says as well that according to Rabbi Yochanan, if you have shnei b'nei adam and shnei transactions, it wouldn't work unless you have that special syntax, which having one matana sandwich in between two Yerushas. But a regular case, what does he say, Rish Lakish? Rish Lakish says that it would work with the special syntax, it would work, right? But if you didn't have the special syntax, it would not work. You have a raya from here that it will work, because here it says it works. How could you possibly say that this is going to be a kasher Rish Lakish, and the Rish Lakish is also abgeschlagen because of this brisa? Rava specifically said that we paskin like Rish Lakish. So Rish Lakish says that if you ustam shnei b'nei adam and shnei salish without any special syntax, it would not work. Over here you see it does work. So really, Rish Lakish seems to hold exactly like the first shita in Rabbi Yochanan, that it would not work. So why isn't it also not a kash Rish Lakish? That's from a loy kash. For Rish Lakish, you can say kan b'toich kedediber, kan la'achar kedediber. If he said the matana, the shnei b'nei adam with shnei sados, using one with a lashon matana and one with a lashon yerusha, if it was all toich kedediber, then the lashon matana applies equally. And he only says that shnei b'nei adam and shnei sados don't work if there was a pause in between. So the first question everybody should ask, why can't you use that same teretz for the regular Rabbi Yochanan? According to Rav Dimi, why are you only going to apply according to Rish Lakish? That will be the obvious question. So the Rashbam says a very simple distinction. So let's look at the Rashbam loy kasha. Loy kasha. Hada katani matana lazeh uyerusha lazeh the kanu shneim. Right, we just brought a raya from a brisa that they both work, even though Rish Lakish says Rish Lakish says that in Rabbi Yochanan that it wouldn't work. Loy kasha the Rish Lakish don't loy kan. According to Rish Lakish, it wouldn't be shver. You know what? Because brisa de ka'amar v'acharecha yirish ploini, that was speaking toich kedei dibur harishon the kamer nichsay loch. All of these gifts, distributions were given toich kedei dibur of each other. Therefore, Hilchach Mahani Matana the Rishon Gam L'Shein. The high the Kamer Rish Lakish, and that Rish Lakish agreed with what Rav Dimi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. That was Loi Kana if it's Shnei B'nei Adam and Shnei Sadois, V'Shnei Sadois or Shnei B'nei Adam, Hai Losh Yerusha, Hainu La'acher Kedei Dibur. That's if he paused in between each individual Nesina. U'Lahachi Loi Mahani Le Losh Matana Dahai Allah unless you use that special syntax. And now let's go and re-clarify what Rish Lakish meant when he made that distinction between the two different options in Rabbi Yochanan. Where it's Shnei B'nei Adam and Shnei Sadois, but that's only if it's B'la'achar Kedei Dibur, right? So even if it's after Kedei Dibur, where normally it would not work if he used the special syntax that proves to us that the lashon matana was referring to both because he sandwiched it in between two Yerushas. That's where you make an exception. But otherwise, if it was not toich kedei dibur and you used shnei sadosh and shnei b'nei adam, it would not work unless it was toich kedei dibur. Even the kamar lashon matana atarvayu afilu la'achar kedei dibur shaperdom. Using a special syntax proves that the lashon matana must be on both. But by default, you don't say that unless it was Teich Kedibur. So now, so why can't you say the same thing? When did they say all these halachas that it doesn't work? Rav Dimi, Rav Elazar. That's only if it was not Teich Kedibur. And the Bryce is Teich Kedibur. The same teretz that works for Shlokish, why can it work for them? Umiyu, Rav Dimi, Rav Elazar, itus v'lagarmin. They don't have this teretz of Teich Kedibur. You know why? The Amri loikana, because they use the word, this is what they said, if you look at their word. They said loikana elo besoda achas oy odom echad. That was the first lashon that when Rav Dimi quoted Rabbi Yochanan, he said loikana elo. Those words. He didn't say it's kind of here. He said loikana elo. It's only kind of, the only place where you can possibly find a way for it to work is by soda achas oy odom echad. Avo shtei soda shnei b'nadam loy. That's what they said. And even Rabbi Elazar said it will not work by Shnei Sadr and Shnei B'nadam. They must, when they said it only works if it's one person in one field, it must mean even if it was Teich Kedibur. Why? Because if they held that there was a place to make a distinction between Teich Kedibur and not Teich Kedibur, then they should have said it differently. The Mizah the Kani B'Shnei Sadr Shnei B'nadam. In the case of Teich Kedibur, that's what they should have told us. Lishma'in the Kana. Instead of saying it'll only work by one person and one other, they should say, no, it only works Teich Kedibur, because that's a bigger chiddush. That's what they should say. The Choshkin Soda Achas V'Odom Echad L'Rav Dimi, or Shtei Sodas V'Odom Echad, or Shnei B'nei Soda Achas L'Rav Elazar. Afilu Lach Kedibur. For sure that'll work Lach Kedibur. But they should have said the biggest chiddush, that even if it's Shnei B'nei Odom, and even if it's Shnei Sodas, it will work. It'll work if it was Teich Kedibur. Elam L'Lo Yodu Limtzo. Lahani Lashon Matana, the Lashon Yerusha, Ella ba'odom echad v'soda achas. It's the only place that they were able to find that it would work, because it says that it only works in these cases. That's how they express themselves. Michlal the b'shnei sadish v'shnei b'nei adam lo'im lakana could never work. There's no possible way to make that work. Even bein toich kedibur, bein lach kedibur. But if you Rish Lakish never expressed it that way. He just said this works. He doesn't say it only works in this case. Once you use such an expression, clearly, you're saying there's no way to find a way for it to work. Okay? Gewaltig. Zogt the Gemara be'ilchus ha'toich kedibur kedibur dami, except for 4 cases, levar me'avodos kechavim and kedushin. And of course, the longer nusach the Tosfos brings down is ovid kechavim, megadef, kedushin, and gerushin. And the reason why these 4 things you don't say toich kedibur kedibur dami, because normally we say you have a couple of seconds to say oops. When you're marrying someone, divorcing someone, or dealing with avodah zarah, you need to be thought through very clearly before you make a move. So there, when people are really careful, they're very serious things, there's no oops factor when someone said that he really meant it. So now you have a quick shaila of how toich kedibur dami works. So one pshat that we have in toich kedibur dami is we look at it like there's a time warp, and that your second isn't over until a second later. So by doing something or by saying something, it's as if it happened simultaneously. You literally look at 2 consecutive seconds as if they're occurring simultaneously. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that we say that he could be chosher from his words a second later. Why would you be able to? So Tosfos quotes a pshat very interesting. If you're in the middle of making a transaction, you're in the middle of buying something from somebody, and you commit yourself to buy something, and then you instantly changed your mind. But at that moment, your Rebbe passed by, and you want to be respectful to him, and you want to be able to tell him, Shalom Aleichem, Rebbe Umari. But if that delay would cause it that I can't be chayzer anymore, then no one's going to greet their Rebbeim. So they made a takana, it's a takana de Rabbanon, that you have a right to back out of something up to a second later, so it allows you to show respect to your Rebbe if he walks by just at that time. The problem with that pshat is Tosfos quotes a case where somebody thought his relative died, and he raised kriya, and then it turned out that his relative didn't die, but he died a second later. So the Gemara says, if the relative died toich kedei dibur of your kriya will still work. Otherwise, it won't. The takana of the Rabbanon that a guy could change his mind up to a second doesn't work. To explain how it would work, he writes free before it happened. That only works if you have the understanding that we look at a second not to be over until a second later. So that's what Tosfos discusses. He says this word and he has the question from that. So most people, I mean, the simplest way to learn is that time is in 1 second. Every second lingers for another second, and it's considered simultaneous if you did it within a second. But that's a big sugya that Rosh Hashiva say share on how Tosfos works. Why is it that time? Why that? Because that's the time span that the time warp works. It's like a second and a half or whatever it is. So they used instead of telling you it's 3 seconds, they told you a way that you would be able to time it. Some people speak faster, some people speak slower. I mean, there's always a splitting of an atom. And then Tosfos tells us about the thing with the Gershon. He says over here, at the bottom of Tosfos, the fourth line from the bottom, the Teichel Dibur. Dami Lavar Mavoit Gechavim Megadev Mekadesh Megarish. Why? Pirish Megadev Shem Gidev. You cursed Hashem. The Chazu by Teichel Dibur Loi Mahanimini. There it doesn't work. Gemara Kitzakam. We should the Megadev have Bechlal Mavoit Gechavim Megarish Bechlal Mekadesh. Itam Echada. Is that you really better be sure before you say something like that. Now the question is, what is Avoid Gechavim Teichel Dibur? So Tosfos quotes a pshat that it means if someone was makdish something like you could say hareza hektish, there you have a second to go back. So Tosfos, it doesn't make sense to say that's pshat because there's no such halacha that when you're makdish something to avodah zarah, it becomes avodah zarah. There's a halacha like that by hektish. If you say I want to be makdish as animal, it gets kedusha, but that doesn't apply to avodah zarah. So Tosfos, the case of avodah zarah might be if someone said you're my, he tells the statue, you're my God, could it be chayzer teichel? Because once a yid designates something as a God, it's asher b'hanah forever. So does he have a second to change his mind? So Zokimar there he doesn't. The problem with it is if you learn it's a time warp, so then why should a avodah zarah be any different? If it's a pshat, a person is not going to die until a second later, and that's why he has a second to back out. So that explains every other transaction. But the problem is there you could say by avodah zarah it's different because there you're going to die right away. It's a much more serious thing. But if you hold that technically a second doesn't end until a second later, so then why should it be any different by avodah zarah? Unless it's exerted the brother over there, I'll try with avodah zarah. But that's what the discussion is around. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll be Mamshech Be'ez Hashem Shabbos Kodesh. So on Shabbos we're learning an hour from Mincha, which I think is 4:40, and we're learning Matzah Shabbos at a half hour